You portray who now?
Father Peter Paul Cooney, who was the chaplain of the 1st Irish 35th Indiana, the Irish Regiment from Indiana. Father Cooney was born in County Roscommon, Ireland. Immigrated with his family at an early age to Monroe, Michigan, where he grew up. Attended the University of Notre Dame, entered the seminary, was ordained a priest in 1859, and became the chaplain of the Irish Regiment from Indiana in 1861. He was the longest-serving Catholic chaplain in the Union Army. He served from 1861 to 1865. He is buried at Notre Dame. He died in 1905, born in 1822.
And yourself, sir, are you actually...
No, far from it, bye-bye. No, I'm a student. I work about 3 part-time jobs, semi-professional actor, writing my master's thesis on the Irish Regiment from Indiana, and that's about it. Don't be wasting any money you're filming me, Your Honor.
The Irish roll as such?
Well, there were 150,000 Irish in the Union Army. By the 1860 census, there was 1.6 million Irish in America. All but 95,000 of those Irish lived in the northern states, or states that would become loyal to the Union. When the war broke out, the Irish flocked to the colors. Literally, during the war, the term Fighting Irish, in meaning and implication, transformed from boisterous, drunken rowdyism to symbology of heroism and gallantry and action on fields of endeavor. The Irish had been discriminated against and questioned and persecuted off and on due to the fact that many of them were, first of all, they were immigrants, threatening the American labor market, so stirred up by the nativists. Also, they were predominantly Catholic, and the big question always was that they were more loyal to the Pope than they were to the U.S. government.
How strongly did the Catholic Church support the war?
Very strongly at first. Then everyone began to waver. Now, of course, there was, as always, a split north and south. In fact, the Archbishop of New York, Archbishop Hughes, and the Bishop of Charleston, South Carolina, Bishop Lynch, they were both sent to the Vatican and Europe in general as emissaries of their respective governments. Lesser number, of course, fought in the South because there were just fewer Irish in the South, although they are turning up as my research. I published a quarterly newsletter on the role of the Irish in the American Civil War. It's called The Harp. And that leads me to research and, of course, subscribers show interest and everything. I like to take it from, it goes much further back, but Private Luke Quinn, who was an Irish immigrant, he was the only Marine killed in action at Harper's Ferry when they broke into the engine house in 1859 to capture John Brown. And then I take it from there to Thomas W. Sweeney, who was a Irish immigrant, fought in the Mexican War, lost an arm, retained the lieutenant's commission, stayed in the Army. In the Civil War, he rose to 2-star general. Resigned in 1865 over a disagreement, somewhere between disagreement or drunken brawl with a fellow general officer. In 1866, he was selected as the Secretary of War for the Fenian Brotherhood, which was an Irish revolutionary group in both Ireland and America. And in 1866, he masterminded the invasions of Canada by the Fenians, which occurred. Primarily Civil War veterans of both North and South of Irish descent who plotted to capture a piece of Canada and swap it for Ireland. Actually invaded Canada, captured a town, partied all night. Canadian militia showed up the next day, and the Irish whipped the Canadian militia, and that's when the U.S. government intervened and caused a withdrawal. 600 men crossed the Buffalo River in Buffalo, New York. They had 3,000 reinforcements waiting in City Park to reinforce them.
Now yourself, portraying a Catholic priest in the Civil War, what activities do the priests and or other religious denominations play in the Civil War?
Well,
in the war scene itself.
The duties were largely unwritten, unstated. Of course, it was the first time the United States put a large army in the field for a long period of time. They were to be, by regulation, of the predominant faith of the men in the regiment, and to tend to their religious needs, and that was about all their designated positions would do. Cooney, which is much like Father Corby, whose statue's at Gettysburg. They knew each other. They were both Holy Cross priests. Corby would go on to be the president of Notre Dame later on. They would see to the troops' religious welfare. They would hold religious services. They would hold such things as catechism classes for those who wanted to convert to Catholicism. They would be called throughout the army they were with to tend to condemn men who were of that faith. Excuse me. Very busy just before and right after battle, preparing the men religiously, tending to the dead and wounded. Father Cooney also collected monies from the men, but with the permission of the regimental commander, and sent them home, or took them back here to Indiana, and either put them in banks or would give them to the families, or saw their other dispositions. I have since been through Father Cooney's account book, which Notre Dame Archives has. Some provisions were, if I'm killed, send the money to an aunt in Ireland, things of this nature. That fundamentally was their duties. They were pretty open-ended. They had the opportunity to play a very strong role, as those two priests did. It is unfortunate in American military history that Catholic chaplains have always come out with a higher reputation than Protestants overall. Of course, being that there are more Protestant chaplains, more possibilities of lesser performance. Chaplain, but also I always like to qualify all that with the fact that certainly a priest has one thing over any other chaplain in a battle scenario, and that he's being celibate, he has nothing to lose. No wife, no family, no tangible property as some chaplains might have.
Now, the Mass as performed today, is it a duplicate or similar to the Mass as performed by the chaplain, priest chaplains back then?
There is a fundamental core that is, of course, the same. The Mass is no longer in Latin. The altar was literally turned around about probably 25, 30 years ago. Those are the fundamental changes that have been made, but certainly the religious rite that stems all the way from the Last Supper remains the same.
And naturally, Mass being celebrated on Sunday, I presume Mass also occurred before battle itself?
It would occur daily, whenever Father Cooney could, and Corby much the same. They would have Mass very early in the morning. There would be Masses of celebration for feast days. In 1863, the Irish Brigade in the Army of the Potomac, which at that time was probably down to about 2,000 or 3,000 men, threw a St. Patrick's Day party for the entire Army of the Potomac, which began with a very large formal Mass. The large formal Masses would have the troops marching to Mass in full equipment with white gloves. The narrator of the Mass would, what's called the principal parts, which in tradition bells were rung. For that Mass, cannons were fired.
What commission did normally a priest hold, or a chaplain, as
They were commissioned, and this was more for pay integrity and proper reimbursement, or proper to maintain themselves, as what they called captains of cavalry on detached service, which meant that that would give them an allowance for a horse, of course, which would be necessary for them to keep up on campaign. There was really no prescribed uniform. Most pretty much wore straight clerical garb. Father Cooney did wear some shoulder boards, like as an officer. They had a cross in the shoulder board with the letter C on one end, the letter N on the other end. Those are being produced for me. He wore a black leather belt and a sash. So he did, and a gold piping down his trousers. So he did have somewhat of a military air about him. Some carried swords. There's one documented case of it. The only documented case during the American Civil War, a chaplain was killed in action. I believe one died of wounds. But there was a chaplain in Gettysburg in one of the first days of confused fighting. I don't remember whether he was north or south. But in fact, I believe he was even on the steps of the church. But he had a sword, and he had drawn the sword. And a soldier shot and killed him.
Mm-hmm.
So there was and that's also been some historic. There was, if you're going to be that obvious and perhaps hedge crossing the line, you take the risk.
How respectful were the opposing forces to the opposites
Very much so. Very much so. You're in the Victorian era, and reading the memoirs that talk both Cooney and Corby, and those are good trends because one's in the east and one's in the west. Numerous accounts of being shot or hearing the bullets go by, being right down there, right behind the firing lines, the men went down. So there was every opportunity to have drawn bead, if you will, to make that deliberate shot. Of course, there was always a risk of just in the mass volley firing they could have been hit, but they never were.
Okay, sure appreciate it. Your name once again?
Kevin Griffin.
And you once again portray
Father Peter Paul Cooney.
Of which division and so forth?
1st Irish, 35th Indiana, the Irish Regiment of Indiana that fought in the west with the Army of the Cumberland. They were in Bardstown, Kentucky. They fought at Chickamauga, Stones River, battles before Atlanta, Lookout Mountain.
Anyway, sure, thank you.